Karl Marx said, "It is not the consciousness of man that determines their social being, but on the contrary, it is the social being that determines their consciousness." And of course, in Marxism, the state ended up being a huge determinant in our social being, how we understood ourselves, our sense of significance, who we are, our meaning, our identity, and so on. But Reich then goes on to say that because of technological advances, for example, in the area of crop growth, we were able to bring control into our environment, into our lives. We were able to have crops that were weather resistant or pest resistant. We began to get control of other areas in our lives, like birth control, control over information, control over our finances. We became less outward oriented in regard, therefore, to our identity, looking out with, but began to look within, because we actually were able to determine our sense of who we are, what we do, how we think. And so Rice said that our modern age could be described as psychological man, that where the search for the question of identity has gone inwards, and so into our, so he defined us as psychological man or woman. Now, of course, his analysis is open to scrutiny, but as a broad brushstroke of where we are kind of philosophically and culturally, I think it's fairly helpful. And of course, our search inwards, along with the growth of other philosophies alongside it, such as deconstructionism by Foucault and all these kind of things. Deconstructionism is a very big word. I'm not entirely sure I know what it means myself, but the way that I tend to think of it in simple terms, because I'm a simple kind of guy, is that imagine that we lived in a Lego movie, you know, where everything is awesome. And so everything was constructed in a certain way, and you were born into that, but then the whole generation decided to pull the Lego parts apart and rebuild it in another way. So it was deconstructed and rebuilt, and I guess that's what people have done to sort of philosophically in terms of our understanding of our identity as being out with. It's kind of been deconstructed and kind of thought about as primarily about, you know, how we feel about it within. And so the search for identity and meaning and purpose and significance and value has turned inwards. But I think sociologists today would say there's still, and I think it's observable in our experience, there's still somehow a search going on. We see a lot of kind of films, you know, talk about that search for meaning and purpose and so on. The writer Donald Miller said that as humanity, we are an entirely beautiful people, but with a terrible problem. It's as though something that helped them function and live well has gone missing. They're pining for that missing thing in all sorts of odd methods, none of which are working. And I guess many today, psychological men and women as we are, feel that. The word psychology comes from two Greek words. It's a composite word, psyche, which means mind or soul, and logos, which means words or study. So it's a study of the mind or of the soul. Often we think of psychology as study of the mind, but also, you know, it could be equally a study of the soul. And with that in mind, indulge me in a thought experiment. Imagine that the soul exists. Imagine that God does exist. If that were true, it would of course change everything, wouldn't it? It would answer a lot of questions, but it would raise a lot of others. But it would mean, for example, that there is a creator, and therefore you and I are not simply chance products of an impersonal universe left to construct our own sense of self and value and worth and meaning and dignity and identity, and looking maybe to more contingent things that can change over time, but for things that we look to for meaning and purpose and a sense of achievement, like success. In that regard, I was reading about Johnny Wilkinson, who, for those of you who don't know who he was the English rugby internationalist who scored the winning drop kick in the World Cup rugby final in 2003 that propelled England to world champion fame. But in his autobiography, he said that I should have been on top of the world. I should have been, I was at the top of my game. I should have felt wonderful. I had bus stop parades, instant sporting fame. But he said, I was almost immediately plunged into depression. I mean, his sense of value and his sense of worth, should have been just through the roof, shouldn't it? But why was it that he didn't feel that? Well, this is what he said. He said, the problem is, you're only as good as your last kick. When you look to those kind of contingent things, those things that can change one minute to the next, then we're on this roller coaster of being up and down in terms of our sense of worth and value. And in a social media saturated world, it may not be only one kick away, but we may only be one click away, or like, or post response, or as students, one exam result or essay score away from a sense of how we feel about ourselves. But what if there was a more stable, robust sense of intrinsic worth given to us by the fact that there is a creator who has made us to have built us with built-in sense of worth and value and meaning? For some, that may feel oppressive. Does it mean that you have to kind of wear white socks and sandals and learn to play the guitar and sing Kumbaya, my Lord? Well, mercifully not. But here's what the Bible says. It says that in the beginning we were made, well, this is the phrase that it uses, that we were made in his image. You might wonder what that means. Well, it means primarily to share his characteristics, his capacities for love and joy and relationships and sense of justice and creativity. But the Bible says that when we turned away our backs on him, that image was shattered. Now, obviously we still bear these things to some degree, but what we have been trying to do ever since is to restore that image from the shattered pieces, rebuild it without God. But what if, and this is the thought experiment, what if God intervened to help us? What difference would that make? Well, I guess in the thought experiment, we're thinking, if there is a God, then I guess the question arises, well, what kind of God is it? Is this God knowable? Surely by definition God is infinite and invisible and so on. So how could God be known? Well, the huge claim at the center of the Christian faith is that God has made himself known through the person of Jesus Christ. Peter, a guy called Peter, who was one of the original 12 followers of Jesus, based on all the evidence that he was able to amass and what he heard Jesus say, what he saw Jesus do, uniquely came to the conclusion that yes, he was able to make God known, that he was the Son of God, that he was who he claimed to be, and did what he said he was able to do. And so what he did was that he passed all that he saw, all that he heard, on to a younger guy called Mark, in what we now call Mark's Gospel, and there are copies of it on your table here. This document is 2,000 years old. Historians would say that what we have in these records of Jesus' life and his teaching written down by Mark from Peter, one of the original followers, are among the most accurate to the original of all the ancient documents, because Christians were really diligent and careful about how they copied the versions, but not only how they copied them, but the fact that they made an incredible number of copies that were distributed around the known world. And what Mark does in his the way that he constructs what he heard from Peter is really interesting, because the first 9 chapters, the first half of the book that he writes, is really all about the question of identity. But not our identity, but the identity of this Jesus, not who I am, but who he is. And he does that for a very specific reason. Let me put it this way. I'm rewatching the BBC Sherlock series with, Benedict Cumberbatch in it. It's brilliant. And in one of the episodes, a lady was given a hairpin by her boss, who was a smuggler, who had picked it up in China, not knowing what it was. In the series, the boss died, and so that's why Sherlock was involved. But at the end of the episode, Sherlock sees the pin in her hair that has been there all the time. He's interviewed her before. He pulls it out, and he says, "Do you know how much this pin is worth?" And I think something like £30 million. £30 million! And she sort of screams all around the office. See, the thing was that it wasn't until she understood the true identity of the pin that she just had it in her hair from the Ming dynasty or whatever it was, that she realised its true value. So Mark draws together all Peter's evidence that has convinced him that Jesus was who he said he was, and understanding who he was, begin to see his true value. When you begin to understand that he was the one who has come to make God known, then he becomes of inestimable value, because he can lead us to God. He can reveal God to us. We learn that Jesus is the one that God, through whom God can be made known, the one through whom we can begin to restore the image of what was broken through the cross and resurrection. I became a Christian around the same age as many of you here. I, at the time, was a fairly accomplished athlete. You can tell it now, but I was. Photo often in the papers, national titles and so on. To be honest, I wasn't really looking for God. But it turned out God was looking for me. I bumped into some Christians and they got me asking about Jesus' identity, who he was. And I remember going away from the conversation thinking, who is Jesus? Who is he really? A preacher that I happened to hear that Easter told me that, well, Jesus had died on the cross for me. Why did he do that? And so I started asking more questions, looking for more answers, more evidence to back up this claim that was made about Jesus. And then there was one day that I was sitting at home and had the most strange thing happen to me. I was sitting and I felt that I'd heard God. It was a strange thing, and I kind of couldn't put it out of my mind, so I thought, you know what, I just need to deal with this. And so I prayed, probably for the first time in my own words. I said, God, I believe that you're out there, and I feel that I've hurt you. Can you please forgive me? And there wasn't much time after that I was thinking about Jesus dying on the cross, where this preacher had told me that he died on the cross for me so that I could be forgiven and know God in my life. And as I contemplated the cross and Jesus dying there for me, I burst into tears. Now, I was a sporting jock. I didn't have feelings. And so for me to burst out into tears was an unusual thing. But I just was overwhelmed by the sense that God would love me and care for me so much that he would do that for me. And just as my tears dried up, I was filled with a sense of the love of God. I can't explain it in any other way. Filled with a sense of the love of God from head to toe. And it changed the direction of my life. I most certainly did not become perfect, but I was changed. See, by grasping not my identity principally, but his identity, who he was, I began to understand my identity, who I was, or who I was becoming, as it became clear as he began to direct my life, that I understood that actually the answers aren't found within, as a psychological man we think they are. They are found out with from the God who has made us. I felt like a gap in my life that I wasn't even really aware was there. I understood suddenly it felt filled. My identity wasn't based on my latest achievement, the sporting realm or whatever, but was centered on who I was in relation to him. And that was a much more kind of robust and centered way to understand who I was that would take me through all the challenges that I would experience later on in life. And over lockdown, it's been really interesting to see in our church, as many others, seeing folks who've come even from atheism become Christians, as lockdown has made us sort of all stop and think, what is the purpose of the life? Why are we here, as we've had time to think about it?